Welcome to Between the Covers, presented by WXEL and Murder on the Beach Mystery Bookstore in Delray Beach. I'm Ann Bocock, and contrary to what the name of the show is, Between the Covers, we're going to do something today and talk about something we've not talked about before.
This one will be between the sheets.
It's sex, and it's scandal, and it has to do with the White House. And let me introduce my guest, who probably needs no introduction to you, but it's Robert Watson. You have seen Robert Watson on television. He is a media commentator. He is the go-to guy for politics and really with the historical perspective. He's also director of American Studies at Lynn University, the author of 30-plus books on American history and politics. It is my pleasure to have Robert Watson as my guest on Between the Covers.
Thanks, Ann. I always enjoy seeing you. We've had the pleasure of interviewing several times.
Yes,
Big
we have.
WXEL fan, so it's a pleasure to be here.
It's always fun for me. Today, we're going to talk about your book, Affairs of State, Presidential Love, Sex, and Scandal, 1789 to 1900. So stuff was going on way back.
There was. You know, when I started this book project, I talked to the publisher, and we were going to have something like a 3,000-page book because there's so many sex scandals. And so they recommended we carve it up, and this is volume one.
Let me tell you, volume one is pretty juicy. The first part of the book says it all. It's titled, They Don't Teach This in School. Now, let me tell you, if they had taught it in school,
right,
I might have paid attention. I might have not cut those 8 o'clock classes freshman year in college. They don't teach it in school.
No, they don't. We'd all be history majors. You know, I always say that I loved history, but I never liked my history professors or history classes because it was rote memorization. It was just one date after another, and you memorized, 1861, but you didn't understand the context. I always say that history is better than anything Hollywood could come up with. The real stories. I sometimes challenge my students. I say, tell me whatever the scandal is that the Kardashians are up to, and I'll tell you something even juicier from history. Tell me whatever is the most heroic movie actor that you've ever seen, and I'll tell you a real person in war that was even better. So the challenge, I think, is to make history try to come to life. And a lot of my books, as you said, are on history or on the presidents. So I had an idea, why not look at the presidents, not when they're at their best, but when they're all too human. And what I found is that they not only put their pants on one leg at a time like the rest of us, but they take them off, one leg at a time like the rest of us. So it was a fun project.
It's got such a juicy title, Affairs of State, and you talk about scandal, but the book isn't just scandals. After I read the book, I realized just how instrumental women were in the beginning of our history.
Absolutely.
And we're talking wives. That might be boring, but it's wives and mothers and also mistresses.
Right. One of my books is on the first ladies, and I think anyone that's married knows that you never make an important decision without consulting the person closest to you. So the fingerprints of the First Lady are all over history. We know the mothers had a great influence. Think of presidents like Franklin Roosevelt, who were really mama's boys, for example. Bill Clinton, raised by a single mother and a grandmother. But then I thought, why not the fingerprints of mistresses as well? There's a long history of this, and it's true. And what really got me into this was I was originally going to write a book on Martha Washington. I always thought there was a Martha Washington we didn't know. The images of her with a little white bonnet, looking kind of dull. She doesn't want to be posing for the painting. And she once had a quote where she said, she described herself as a, quote unquote, an old-fashioned Virginia housekeeper, steady as a clock, busy as a bee, and cheerful as a cricket. Well, that's cute, but it kind of makes her look like all she does is bake cookies. When Martha Washington was a power player. So I was going to write that book, but I found a letter that made me write this book. And here is the letter. The person closest to George Washington was Alexander Hamilton, more like a son. Washington never had a son. Hamilton was illegitimately born in the Caribbean, so they had a father-son thing going on. So Hamilton knew Washington better than anyone. During one of the winters of the war, when Martha crossed hundreds of miles in the freezing dead of winter through enemy territory on unpaved roads in an open wagon to be with George, Hamilton writes the following. He writes, "Thank goodness Lady Washington has arrived. The good general has been inconsolable. Now we can get down to the matter of winning the war. And I thought, Martha Washington, this is hyperbole. What does he mean Martha's going to help him to win the war? She's going to sew uniforms, cook. And then I had a thought. I wonder if she didn't provide George with some wifely services. He hadn't seen her in 9 months. He thought he was going to die. It was a wartime, the emotions. And I began to think about the idea of George and Martha between the sheets. And I thought, that's something I never got in class. That's not something in any of the Washington books, but surely the Washingtons did it. So I began to step back, and I looked up some of Washington's love letters, including teenage letters. And I found 2 letters written when he was about 16. And in both cases, he was dumped. Dumped by older women. He was always trying to date above himself socially, older, wealthy women. I always say he would have been darn good at Meisner Park in Boca. Or I could see him at Worth Avenue, all 6'2". So he tries to date these young girls, and they're dumping him. And in one of the letters, he writes, "Roses are red, violets are blue" poems. He ends it, he says, "My poor wounded heart, it's been shot through by Cupid's dart." So here's George with
I
acne.
don't see George Washington writing that.
Right, you don't, because you see him like this, right? He's like Captain Morgan crossing the Delaware River like this. But it gave another side to him, and I began to think, you know, these presidents had love affairs. They had their heart broken, their hearts fluttered, and that gives us a unique perspective on the presidents, their decision-making, the role of their wives, the role of women throughout history. And so the book's much more than just telling some scandals about who did and who didn't do it.
You bring up Martha Washington. There's a lot we don't know, but she was older than George
She was.
and much more well-connected.
She was.
So was he a bit conniving in selecting a wife?
Let's put it this way. George always tried to court older, wealthy women, and he was always turned down until he met Martha, who was an older, wealthy woman. Martha was a widow. Her husband was one of the wealthiest, if not wealthiest, heirs of a great tobacco empire in Virginia. She had 4 kids, 2 died in infancy. So here's this widow with this huge tobacco fortune and 2 young kids. Back then, folks married a lot quicker, remarried a lot quicker than they do today. George was in his mid-20s, very ambitious, still without money, lost more battles than he had won, and he's on his way back home to Virginia to visit with the colonial governor, a guy named Dinwiddie. He passes by a neighbor named Chamberlain. Chamberlain says, "Won't you stop and have dinner with me tonight?" George says, "I can't. I need to get to Williamsburg to meet with the governor." Chamberlain says, "That's a shame, because joining me tonight for dinner is the wealthiest widow in all of Virginia."
Aha!
George stayed for dinner, stayed the night, stayed for breakfast. Here's what we know. George courted Martha with lightning speed. He shows up at one of her 4 mansions shortly thereafter and orders an engagement ring from a fellow named Robert Cary, C-A-R-Y. So George moved quickly. In marrying Martha, he not only became enormously wealthy, but as you correctly noted a moment ago, he gained the political, social, and economic connections he would need to become the Washington that history remembers. I think Washington was perhaps the greatest American to live. So I'm not a revisionist historian at all, but I will stand behind this comment. If George had never married Martha, we never would have heard of him.
There, see? the point exactly, how influential women were. One of the greatest stories that I loved in the book is Grover Cleveland, because I didn't know this. Yeah. Please tell that story.
Well, Grover Cleveland was the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, and he was unmarried when he went into office. There was a huge scandal, a huge brouhaha around his campaign. Cleveland, when he was a young man, had moved from New Jersey to Buffalo, and he was a successful lawyer. His law partner was a guy named Oscar Folsom. They practiced law together, they went out for dinner together, they drank together, they were inseparable. They were also sleeping with the same woman together. Her name was Maria Halpin. She was from Pennsylvania, loose morals. And what happens is Maria Halpin gets pregnant, and the 3 of them, no one knows who the father is. So Maria Halpin complicates things between Grover Cleveland and Oscar Folsom by naming the kid Oscar Folsom. So Cleveland was a bachelor, so he provides the money and accepts responsibility. Folsom has a daughter, and shortly after this, Folsom dies in a carriage wreck. And Cleveland had an enormous amount of money, so he takes care of the widow, takes care of the young daughter, becomes the godfather. She called him, the young girl, Frances, called him Uncle Cleve. He called her Frankie. So he was her godfather, raising her from the time she was a baby. Well, what happens is when Cleveland runs for the presidency, he starts sending her letters, and the letters change, and they become hot and juicy. I've read them. Almost had to have a cigarette while I was reading the letters. He proposes marriage to this 21-year-old goddaughter.
And he was how old at the time?
He was old enough to be her father or
Okay,
grandfather
all
at
right.
the time. So it was sort of Palm Beach County family values,
Here
I
we
guess
go.
you could say. What happens is the widow says, no, my daughter needs some time to think about this. She's marrying the sitting president at your age and all this and that, to Cleveland. So she says, I'm going to take her to Europe. She did a tour. And while she's there, Cleveland sends her these batches of love letters. And the love letters are leaked to the press. So the press reports on this. Now, the problem was this. Cleveland didn't call her Frankie or Frances. He called her all these names like everyone in your audience uses, like muffins and cupcake and pumpkin and lovey-dovey. Right, Ann? We know about these things. So the press thought Cleveland was trying to marry the widow. So the press is in New York waiting at the harbor to, the paparazzi, the more the things change, everyone, the more they stay the same, ready to get a story from the widow. Cleveland sends his presidential yacht out. He brings the young 21-year-old Frances into the White House on an end around the press. They get married in the White House. It was a huge scandal. By the way, she was roughly the same age as another young woman named Monica, who was once upon a time in the White House.
However, she did become a good first lady.
Frances Folsom Cleveland was one of the best first ladies in history, is one of my heroes from history. She was elegant, smart, charismatic. She was an amazing woman. And after the scandal died down, the public fell in love with her. In fact, she had two young daughters, one in the White House and one in between presidential terms. And you know how the press covered the Kennedy children? They couldn't get enough of little John under the presidential desk, or Caroline's pet pony, Macaroni. Well, they couldn't get enough of Frances and the two young girls. When her daughter, Ruth, was born, they named the candy bar after baby Ruth. That's where the candy bar comes from. She was an amazing woman. There's a cute story by one reporter who says that Cleveland one day was waiting by a carriage ready to go out fishing, I believe it was, and Frances was taking forever to get ready. And the reporters are gathered and they're waiting and they're waiting. Finally, Cleveland just, curses and storms off and goes into the house and said, there's nothing to cover today, I'm not going fishing, slams the door. The press didn't leave because they knew. A few minutes later, the door opens up by Cleveland and Frances comes out looking like $1 million, and Cleveland sheepishly gets in the carriage and goes out with her. So she was an amazing woman at a time when women were not typically well-educated or politically active, but she was.
She managed to ride that scandal pretty well.
Oh, yes.
And come out on the other side
She did.
looking wonderfully. Didn't always happen that way. One of the other chapters I loved was Andrew Jackson, and that was a scandal.
Yeah. Andrew Jackson's wife, Rachel Donaldson, was probably the most scandalous woman of the 18 teens and 20s. What happened, her father had taken a group of settlers from Virginia to what is now Tennessee, and was really the founding father of the Tennessee Territory. So Rachel, as a teenager, was kind of the debutante of this new territory. And she did what a proper girl ought not to do. She ran away and married a much older man. His name was Louis Robards. Well, Robards turns out to be a ne'er-do-well, so Rachel did what women definitely didn't do back then. She left him.
Yeah,
She left him and goes back home. Around the time, there's an Indian raid on this settlement in Tennessee, and Rachel's father, brothers, a lot of men get killed in the raid. Now, she and her mother are living alone in the middle of hostile Indian territory. And one of the boarders that comes to stay at their house is a young, tall, dashing Indian fighter and traveling judge named Andy Jackson. They fall madly in love. It's one of the true passionate love affairs in the history of the presidency. The problem, of course, was she was married and women could not legally get a divorce at the particular point in time. So Jackson encourages Rachel to contact Robards. Ultimately, Jackson writes Robards a letter where he says, if you don't give her a divorce immediately, I'm going to come and cut off both your ears with my sword and something else too. So Robards gives her a divorce. She marries Andrew Jackson and then finds out Robards never gave her the divorce. So she was married to two men at the same time. They called her Lady Bigamist, or even the Whore of Tennessee. It was a horrible scandal. And when Jackson was running for president in 1828, his critics said that he was a wife thief and said that there will be a whore hosting in the White House. Rachel took this news horribly, as you can imagine.
And that was printed in the paper.
It was. It
That
was in the paper. It was
terrible.
discussed in Congress. It was heckled and people shouted out. It had made newspapers all across the country. And Rachel prayed and hoped that she would never have to go to Washington, to the White House. I always say, be careful what you hope for and pray for. Right after his election, but before his inauguration, she dies of a heart attack. She's buried in the gown that she was going to wear for the inaugural. So Jackson goes to his inaugural in 1829, a widower. It was a really tough and difficult story. And Jackson was I don't know that he ever got over it, quite frankly.
You're right. You couldn't make that up.
No, you couldn't.
And if you put that to a script in Hollywood, they wouldn't buy it because it would just be too ridiculous.
And there's no way that if I made this up and tried to sell it to a scriptwriter as a novel or something, they would never take it. And the story even gets better. Jackson goes to the White House a widower. He doesn't have children. So now the question is, who's going to be his hostess? Jackson's best friend is this guy named John Eaton, a fellow senator from Tennessee. Eaton gets married right before the inauguration, and he marries the most famous whore in Washington, a girl they called Little Peg. And Jackson makes Little Peg his hostess. So they said there was going to be a whore hosting, and I'll be darned if there wasn't.
They got one.
The women of Washington boycotted the inaugural. They boycott the White House. Daniel Webster, the great intellect and member of Congress, and an intellectual member of Congress today is an oxymoron, but Daniel Webster, he has a toast at the inaugural. He says, here's to Secretary Eaton, who married his mistress and the mistress of all the rest of us, too. And when the women of Washington continued to boycott the White House, Webster says, his next toast, he says, here's to the next cabinet. May they all be bachelors. So we don't have to, but so it was a huge scandal. But even that brouhaha dies down, and Jackson gets reelected. And despite being an honorary fellow, is one of the better presidents in American history.
You know, it's amazing to me that some of these women actually did get a pass, and they became the hostesses, which was what the first ladies were then. When I think now of first ladies that have made such an impact, of course I think Eleanor Roosevelt, and I'm thinking Jackie Kennedy, but things were so different then.
They were, and women back then also had the problem that a woman was not supposed to be political. Women could not vote until 1920. They weren't going to the type of schools. They couldn't run for office. Jeanette Rankin was our first female member of Congress. It wasn't until 1917, and ironically before women even got the right to vote. So one of the few avenues to political power available to women was spousehood. So you see that a lot of these presidents and first ladies are making the presidency their career. It's a shared career. So I remember in 1992 when Bill Clinton was running for office, and he threw out a line once where he said, you know, you buy one, you get one free, speaking of Hillary, 2 for the price of 1. And Clinton's critics were aghast. And I remember writing and saying, are you kidding me? We've been buying one and getting one free since George and Martha, since John and Abigail Adams, since James and Dolly Madison. And those three, Martha Washington, Abigail Adams, and Dolly Madison, were powerhouses. If the latter two were alive today, they would be in Congress. So yeah, this is nothing new.
The one thing I remember about history and Dolly Madison was that she saved all the artwork when the Brits were going to burn the White House down, so more power to her.
Dolly is magnificent. She's one of my all-time favorites in history. 200 years ago this summer, we're celebrating the bicentennial. The White House was burned by the British, and President Madison was out in the field with the troops. Dolly was back with one maid or attendant at the White House. And Madison is worried she's going to be burned or captured or killed. So he dispatches a courier to meet with her and get her out of the White House. She sends a letter back with the courier. She doesn't leave. The letter survives, and I reprinted it in my most recent book. In the letter, she says, quote unquote, I refuse to abandon my post. And then she goes on to write, and she says, if the ladies of the chefs, the women in the White House, the maids, the secretaries, if you gave us enough cannons, I would run one out of every window of this building and defend it. Gotta love Dolly Madison. I think I wrote in the book that She had bigger cojones than a lot of the generals that ran away. And I'm quite certain that's the only time that's been mentioned on your very serious and cerebral show.
I think so.
So at the 11th hour, when it was, this will be my last appearance on WXEO, I suppose, but by the book. At the 11th hour, when Dolly climbs up on top of the roof of the White House with what she said was a spyglass and watched the British marching to the building, she gets two young men, we believe they were slaves, and a woman, and they get a wagon, and she saves the priceless artifacts from the White House, including the wonderful Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington, the giant portrait hanging in the East Room with him in black holding his hand out. They can't get it out of the frame, so she orders the men to break the frame. She rolls the canvas up, and at the 11th hour, skedaddles out of the building. What a marvelous service she rendered to our nation's capital. And another thing people don't know is it was so embarrassing that Washington was burned, and most people didn't like Washington, D.C. back then, like the anti-Washington rhetoric today. So there was a lot of talk of making Harrisburg or Baltimore or Philadelphia or New York the capital. Dolly is the one that gave the main speeches saying, no, we will rebuild. This will be the capital. She climbs the steps of the burnout building and talks to the citizenry with their heads hung low, dejected after their capital was burned, and gives one of those Winston Churchill speeches. So Dolly Madison was, she did more than just introduce ice cream when Thomas Jefferson was president. Yeah. She was an amazing woman.
I think she's my hero.
She's one of mine.
I really do.
No doubt about it.
You know, I know that for the book, you did a lot of research, and so much of it had to have been from letters.
Yeah.
And think about now how we correspond, and it's, you know, a text message or a tweet with 144 characters. What's going to happen in history when somebody wants to document this era?
What a great question. And that's the pickle that we're going to find ourselves in. Letter writing was high art back then. It was not uncommon for a Jefferson or a Washington to sit for an hour or two at night and write letters and letters and letters. And people did whatever they could to preserve those letters. And the letters are rich in detail. For example, I was giving a speech once, and someone that had read one of my books said, "Did you make all this stuff up?" I said, "Why would you say that?" And they said, "Because you said in the letter, George Washington rose at 7:10 a.m. He had 2 eggs and 2 pieces of ham. He slaughtered 2 pigs that day, and it was very humid and 75 degrees. They said, "How did you make all that up?" I said, "I didn't. Washington put it all in one of his letters." So not only did they write letters, Ann, but they were chock full of detail. They were rich, personal, touching letters. So through these letters, I was able to find out all sorts of information, including the letters of wives of senators who couldn't help but notice when the president was looking over at an attractive young woman, and then those letters would lead me to some information, and I would track it down, and sometimes it proved to be nothing other than tongues wagging, other times it proved to be an affair. But today, with 140 characters in Twitter and people just texting LOL, LMFAO without writing, we don't even know what an adverb is anymore, an adjective. So historians in the future are going to have a rough time, I think, weeding through all the misinformation and just the excessive amounts of useless, mindless data to find something true. Take Twitter or take Facebook. 99% of it is just garbage. How do we discover the truth? How do we find out? And today, politicians don't write those kind of open letters because they know someone's going to get a hold of them.
Exactly.
So I think historians in the future, ironically, are going to have a worse time than we do today.
Even though there is the 24-hour news cycle and every part of your day is documented.
Imagine one historian watching Fox and another one watches MSNBC. And one decides Obama's the Antichrist and the other one says he walks on the water. They're going to have to watch public broadcasting and community broadcasting to get to the truth. Sure. Because if one reads this magazine or that magazine, the misinformation is so extraordinary. I think it's going to be harder in 100 years than it is today.
I have to ask, but before we end this, about the Lincolns.
Sure.
Mr. and Mrs., because if we all saw the Spielberg movie, we have this image of Mary Todd Lincoln as this very disturbed, demanding, high, you know, really,
high maintenance, high anxiety.
Woman.
Yes,
and was that true?
It was. The Spielberg movie was spot on. I thought it was very accurate. And the depiction of Abe and Mary Todd, I thought, was both of them were well depicted. Spielberg and Tony Kushner get an A on that one, in my opinion. Mary Todd was a handful. Lincoln's two private secretaries, John Hay and John Nicolay, both magnificent young men, they used to call her the Hellcat. And at one point, Hay writes a letter when Lincoln's traveling and says something to the effect of, "Don't hurry back, the Hellcat is getting Hellcatier by the moment." After the Lincolns, when they first married, they lived in a upstairs above it was basically a tavern. It was called the Globe, as in the Shakespearean Theater. And folks there reported and wrote letters that they'd hear a great fuss upstairs. Old Abe would come running out of the building, followed by pots and pans. It was the Lincolns, it was almost a marriage that they couldn't live with one another, couldn't live without one another. So it was infinitely more complex than on the surface. Mary Todd loved politics. Abe loved politics. They both lost their mothers at a tender age. They were both type A personalities with a love for literature. So they did have a bond. However, she was a high-maintenance woman used to money, and he was poor and absent-minded. So that was doomed from the get-go. Her entire family, the Todds, did not like Abe. They spelled her name T-O-D-D, and Lincoln used to joke. He would always say, "While one D is quite good enough for God, the Todds require two," is what he would say. But they had an off-again, on-again, very turbulent marriage, but it was a solid political union. And Mary Todd, we must remember, lost 3 of her 4 children. She loses her husband,
Yes.
almost every male relative. The South hates her for marrying Lincoln. The North never trusts her. She led a Shakespearean life. It was truly tragic.
And if this doesn't wet your whistle for the next book, nothing will. But this stops at 1900, and the next book will pick up.
We'll pick
at
up
the
with lots
1901
more, and
with
who knows how many volumes.
A lot more scandals. I began the conversation applauding you for what you do as a teacher, which is so near and dear to my heart. And thank you so much, because if
Thank
you
you,
can
Anne.
get people to love history the way you teach it, that is just fantastic. I thank you so much. The book we're talking about today, Affairs of State, read it, buy it. It's wonderful. Robert
Thanks, Anne.
Watson, thank you.
It's always a pleasure.